three presenters, but it's just the two of us for now, so hopefully that gives more time for some conversation and questions. But first of all, we're going to have a presentation by Xavier Durham, so I'll turn it over to you.
I got a presentation. Hello, good morning. How's everyone doing? Very excited for 8 a.m., I'm sure. So I guess while I'm opening up the presentation, hi, I'm Xavier Durham. I am finishing up my undergraduate degree in sociology at the University of Texas at Austin, and will be starting the PhD program in sociology at UC Berkeley this fall. Yay. So, let's get started. All right, so, welcome to Policing and Race Criminal Justice Surveillance in Brazil. To give you all a bit of insight as to why my work is in Brazil, well, first of all, I'm not Brazilian, but a lot of people think I do, and I look like I'm from Rio, so I guess it helps to kind of blend in, right? But my work started back when I studied abroad in the summer of 2016 and sort of worked with different Black grassroots organizations in Brazil, and so that sort of spurred my interest to continue that work leading up into my graduate career. So just to provide you all with a very brief overview, we're going to be going to race and its interactions with surveillance, the growth of insecurity in Latin America, a case study in understanding the, I guess, disparities in observation when it comes to white and Black populations, as well as the future of violence between the state and the market. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, good, thank you. So I'd like to start off with a quote from my advisor and a woman that I just idolized for her intellectual contributions to the field of surveillance studies, Simone Brown, from her book Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness. To see surveillance as ongoing is to insist that we factor in how racism and anti-Blackness undergird and sustain intersecting surveillances of our present world. So just to kind of set the mood. So beginning with Simone Brown's thesis is this idea that surveillance began with African enslavement, or at least modern understandings of surveillance when it comes to biometric technology, controlling populations when it comes to movement, as well as keeping them visible in the public eye. So if we think about biometrics, when it comes to weight, height, any phenotypical descriptions to describe Black populations or African slaves that may have escaped, right? How do you identify them? How do you say, this is the person that's escaped, help me find them? Slave passes to sort of control the movement in between plantations, as well as lantern laws, which for those of you who don't know, lantern laws were set to keep indigenous and Black populations visible during the night. They were forced to carry lanterns as they walked around different areas, that way they could always be seen. Now, if we are taking it as surveillance starting at African enslavement, then that means that inherently observation is white. We have Black, non-white bodies being observed consistently, which means to not be watched makes it a privilege. Invisibility in itself becomes a privilege. So I'd like to start off with a fun little structure that has been the basis for a lot of surveillance theory for a long time, the panopticon. Now, the panopticon was proposed by late 18th century English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, where he said, I want to create a prison that basically regulates populations by sight. So you have a central tower in the middle being able to see into every single cell. With how the tower was set up, the lights were reflected so it looked like it was always occupied. So you can never actually know if someone was in the tower or not. However, because you didn't know that, people in these cells would constantly act as if they're being watched all the time. Now Foucault took this a bit further, and he's like, it's not only observation, but it's a fact of regulation and regimen. So we have observation going, but by bringing in disciplinary power, by consistently keeping people tied to schedules, we can sort of make them and mold them into particular political subjects who will act as if they're being observed even when they're no longer under observation. Now this has dominated surveillance theory forever, and quite honestly, people are sick of it. Why? Because it actually is very limited in how we understand power in surveillance. Because when Foucault is looking at this in his book Discipline and Punish, he's looking at France. And what's the fun thing about France is that it's white, right? Full white population, and these are how we understand power. But what happens when we throw race into things? Now, the Panopticon was never actually constructed. It was proposed to be built on the River Thames in the United Kingdom. I'm sorry, in Great Britain. But it serves as an inspiration for regulatory systems in both Western Europe and the United States. And in the mid-1800s, Brazil was like, we want a piece of the action. We want to join modern democracies and have a regulatory type of prison. So in the mid-1850s, they opened up the correction house, or the Casa de Correção, right? And basically they say, we want to regulate black populations to sort of integrate them into society. Now, a note about this, though, is that abolition didn't come to Brazil until 1888. They were the last country in the Western Hemisphere to actually abolish slavery. So you have people who are opening up a prison in the mid-1850s, and they still have about 4 decades of a dehumanizing process of enslavement for black bodies. So how does that work? Well, unfortunately, it creates more of a pendulum motion when it comes to power. So Foucault had this idea that we start with sovereign power, right? We impose our will upon others through physical violence or other coercive means to get them to do something. Then we go to disciplinary power with the idea of panopticism, or over time you sort of act as if you are being regulated consistently, observed all the time. But in the case of the Casa de Correção, what happens is that the Brazilian elite who are in support of this prison eventually call and say, we need to actually use violence, again, to control these populations because we don't feel that they can actually be integrated into society. So we see that swing, we see the evolution of power Foucault proposes, but the moment non-white bodies enter the frame, it goes right back to a need for violence. And even in the United States, while not as extreme, we can see cases of observation of non-white bodies being consistently put on display for the state. So this is the Omnipresence Project that was started in New York back in 2014, where in low-income, high-crime project neighborhoods, they would put these lights that would be on all night, right? So you hear the hum of these generators constantly, lights would be shining through the windows of people, keeping them awake, disrupting sleep schedules. But basically, these were only put in non-white areas. So there's this consistent observation of non-white bodies, and basically a white state always observing them. So as race goes into the mix, we actually see that not every population is watched the same, and some populations are watched more than others. Even beyond this, think about who's called for random TSA checkpoints, right? Muslim and Sikh people, for example. The ever so lovely stop and frisk, right, that we have going on for primarily black and Latino youth. But let's go back to Latin America, sort of dial back a bit. Now, back in the 1980s, there was this increase in the feelings of urban insecurity, basically, where waves of criminality were just going in and out, and people were starting to become scared. The problem is, though, is that these reports were all given by the state, but there was no actual documentation of anything actually rising. My apologies. So what we see is that the state is actually ratcheting up the fear of criminality, rather than it actually coming to fruition. Now, this leads to the mass increase in the consumption of surveillance technology. In 2010, Brazil consumed 35% of all surveillance technology in South America. Leading up to the World Cup and the Olympics, they were projected to reach 45% of all surveillance technology consumption. So that includes CCTV cameras, electronic gates, and the like to sort of protect themselves from these waves of criminality. And the problem is that with these mega events, and with the growth of gentrification and other consumer spaces, these are chafing more and more with black populations and black residencies. And because of that, there's the increase in drive to protect property at all times. Now, this makes a very weird case because for a long time, especially leading up to the period of democratization in the mid-20th century, there were these things called death squads that were initially approved by the state, but later condoned because they don't actually investigate them now. Death squads are composed of military police, they're composed of officers who have been dismissed for violent tendencies, ex-veterans, and just vigilantes who have no proper training at all, but are willing to protect property. So throughout the nights, they would actually be terrorizing black populations. Now, with the growth in the need to protect property, these same people are being hired for daytime surveillance and policing of these same areas. So we see that there's suddenly a blend of both daytime and nighttime death squads. But the difference is, though, is that the ones in the daytime are actually employed by businesses. And back in 2000, almost 50% of the police force force either worked for these private industries or completely gave up their careers to just work for private industries because the state cannot pay them as well as these private places. So now they're no longer beholden to the law, even during the daytime. Now, again, we think, well, what about observation? Can people sort of watch back? What are the role of cameras in sort of controlling this brutality? Well, back in 2001, the favela community of Jacarezinho, or favela is an urban shanty town, they wanted to put up cameras and gates to sort of stave off police brutality. Now, these numbers haven't really changed lately, but let's give you all an idea of just the degree of brutality that we see in Brazil. So back in 2016, roughly 4,200 people were killed by the military police across Brazil, and that was a 26% increase from 2015. Now, compare that to the United States, where in the same year, 963 people were killed by the police. And that's in a population of 110 million more people than Brazil. But we see that almost by a factor of 5 more people are killed in Brazil collectively. And in 2015, 70% of those victims were black. And also keep in mind that this was only what was reported, because most killings in Brazil are reported as self-defense and therefore not registered as homicides. So we don't actually even know the full scale of this violence that we see. Sorry, that got a bit dark, let's just breathe. But now back to this case. So they want to control this brutality, they want to control the police and basically say, we are not going to tolerate this, we're going to record, that way in case we need to bring any cases to the court, we have proof of this. So they put up the gates, they put up the cameras, and instantly the state and the media are outraged. They don't want this to happen. They say, you're protecting criminals, why don't you trust us? Whose authority are you trying to answer to? And basically eventually have them take it down. But then when activists want to say, well, what about the high-rise condominiums that are putting up cameras? What about the white neighborhoods that are putting up cameras? And the police just basically say, well, we don't have to go there. We don't have to worry about drug trafficking yet as we do here. Now what's the big problem? Brazil has not codified any laws against public surveillance. In fact, the only private space is the home. So anything outside of that is fair game. But only the low-income black populations are the ones who can't actually watch. So in review, if we're following Simone Brown's thesis, surveillance is a legacy of surveillance stems from African enslavement. The observational tools are in themselves white and reinforced white colonial hierarchies. Latin American security has sort of catalyzed the consumption of surveillance technology. And because Afro-Brazilians are criminalized and being less than human and worthy of extermination, they're initially marked for death. And point 5, see point 2, surveillance is dead. But now, what's the speculation that I see going forward, though? So private security companies are increasing in popularity. They're buying up more police. The state can't compete with the payrolls. They become daytime death squads. And a speculation that I see going into the future that could even be a reflection of any neoliberal trends that we see when it comes to privatization, even here in the United States or across other areas of Latin America, is that these states are losing their monopolies on legitimate forms of violence. They no longer control the police. They basically have people who ultimately will kill with extrajudicial means and never actually have to answer for their crimes. And thus, we're seeing that violence is in itself becoming somewhat of a commodity, right? That it's becoming, it's going under greater elite oversight, right? So now it's that one thing that states sort of had some level of regulation and the ability to investigate, but now that's no longer the case because those that are doing the killings no longer have to answer to the state. And thank you. Before we get to the next presentation, I'd like to open just up a couple minutes for questions or comments that you all have related to this information or anything you want. Yes, sir?
You know, kind of my ADHD's kicking in because like there's so many things that you hit, but a couple things that I'm real curious about is how would this be a model for, how similar is this as a model for surveillance in other countries in terms of how surveillance is evolving? And is it ultimately, do you think, going to evolve in the same way?
Okay, that is definitely a good question. So in regards to how surveillance is similar across the board, it's quite difficult because when we think about actually vast manifestations of surveillance, these are people who are populations that are normally sort of sealed away, right? Like they're not even seen in the first place and are just under state oversight. So it's sort of difficult to in some way see these interactions, as well as understanding the full effects. In some ways, we can only understand it as the levels of violence. It becomes pornographic in some ways to actually just see it as, okay, now we see actual manifestations of the surveillance and this coercive control and the like. So quite honestly, I would say that it would have to be something that I need to explore more, and something that I could see potentially even happening in the US in the future with the idea that, or Nelson Batella pointing out that we're looking into more Latin Americanization of race relations where it's just, not just, it's white and black, yes, but now there's this blending, but there's still this valuation of whiteness. And so even going with the whole slew of military regimes going on Colombia, Peru, Argentina, and this launch back to right-wing sort of autocratic controlling governments, and the need to curb populations, the need to say that there are no black people in these areas, or blackness doesn't exist, and therefore we can't discriminate against these populations. I'd say that it's quite a difficult call initially, but it would be something for future research.
Yes. Is there any movement among the black communities to create their own police, private surveillance within their own communities, like create a company for themselves and call that back their surveillance of the communities to kind of counteract the way that we see in private companies?
There have been pushes to try to do short-scale stuff, such as what happened in JANEIRO, where they were trying to control their own borders. But the problem is that not only does the state immediately have those torn down, but with death squads roaming at night, there's this constant terrorism going on, where the moment that someone speaks up, they're basically killed, right? For lack of a better word, and it actually is that brutal, even just speaking out once. Which, by the way, I'd like to point out that for those of you who don't know, Councilwoman Marielle Franco was killed back on March 14th after speaking out against the militarization of Rio de Janeiro. So just an idea that even speaking out. But at the same time, I don't want to rob black populations of their autonomy in this case, because there's this consistent need to make that even if they can't watch, there's this ability to sort of hide and occlude the state vision. The black militant organization Reaja Ser Morto, or React or Die, is a big movement that is in Salvador Bahia, which is sort of labeled as the Black Mecca of Brazil. And what they ended up doing, and they started 10 years before Black Lives Matter too, so they were already sort of calling into question state brutality. And what they've done is sort of, for example, put walls up in front of their homes as a protection device as well, but also so that it becomes harder for the state to sort of observe and understand what they're doing. So I don't necessarily want to rob them of autonomy and just say, oh, they're just victims of terrorism. They're not, it's not a victimhood process.
I have one question. I was in Brazil in 2000 for a few months for work. Spent time onshore and offshore. I know, speaking to one of the Brazilians, we get reports every weekend, at the end of each weekend, how many people were murdered in Sao Paulo, for instance. Looking at 60, 70 murders. So this was not associated with police violence, it was just murders going on. The economy has grown considerably in the last 18 years. Is violence overall down? And is this a counter trend to the economy getting better and violence going down?
So violence is actually going up. Leading up to the Olympics, as I said earlier, I'm sorry, from 2015 to 2016, violence increased by 26%, leading up to the over 4,000 reported killings. But that's just five days. That's just 5 days. Now, overall murders, they are still basically the same, but that's still also dependent on what's reported too. The state basically controls all the data flow and all sort of what's understood to be deaths in those particular cases, or sort of who's murdered. So it's quite difficult to say that I have solid numbers to say that there's an increase or there's a decrease, because it's all dependent on what the state wants to report to outlets or researchers or anything of the like. Now, in regards to the economy improving, I only see it going up because Michel Temer just recently proposed that there's going to be a $28 billion privatization project where a bunch of things are starting to become I guess, subsumed into private industries such as electrical companies and so on and so forth, providing public services to Brazilian people. Now, if I add that to the fact that these companies are buying their own security and their own defense forces, and basically being able to kill people just to protect these particular properties or these areas, I don't see it going down. If anything, I see it increasing within these next couple of years, and it just further indicated that a military intervention in Rio, or potentially rumored to spread to Salvador or to spread to Sao Paulo, that there's going to be this consistent need to take back the city. And so that would just further justify the need to kill and pacify these particular regions. Yes?
Two quick questions that maybe outside of the scope of the geography you're looking at, but just wanted to know what's going on, if you know what's going on in Bahia State. And then secondly, wealthy blacks, are they involved in this conversation? If you could talk a little bit about that, either of those things.
So, the first point, that would have to be something for future research, I suppose. For the second point, there's a very interesting racial dynamic in Brazil. So, there was never any sort of codified segregation that happened, and so there was no marked distinction between white and black. There was no hyper-descent. And so basically, class became somewhat of a conduit for less low-income black populations to sort of rise through the ranks. So there's this saying, Branco da Bahia, or the white of Bahia, because in actuality, the more money you have, the whiter you are in some ways, and you can actually purchase your whiteness with particular cards from the government to say, no, I am white. So the black elite, or the black middle class, have a tendency to sort of pull away from their blackness, to sort of say, we are no Brazilian, we are part of this, we are part of the nation. We don't want to create these divisions, we're doing well, we're succeeding. We don't want to focus on these issues because with the whole decolonized mindset, they just say they're not trying hard enough, they're just criminals. They don't want to actually embrace what we are as a nation. They don't want to erase these divisions. They still want to hold on to this blackness that doesn't exist, even though more than 50% of the population is considered black. So in speaking to that, it's just the fact that money whitens. And so they don't necessarily empathize or sympathize with the struggles of the black population to self-identify as such. Thank you. I'll take one more question because I would like to give time to the other presenter. All right, thank you all very much.
Well, thank you very much, and hopefully there'll be some interesting ways to connect these presentations as well, because I'm also going to talk about issues to do with racial politics of surveillance. So my name is Stephen Young. I'm an assistant professor of geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm going to talk about some work that I've been doing in municipal archives, primarily in Detroit, as well as also Chicago, Seattle, and New York, focusing on the period from 1940 to 1970. So this obviously coincides with the second wave of the Great Migration. And what I've been looking at, the emergence of a series of little-known programs that emerged during those years, spearheaded by Northern liberals, which sought to tap into and regulate the mood or atmosphere of cities in order to try and prevent episodes of racial unrest. And what I'm going to argue is that these programs actually produced racially differentiated forms of surveillance and policing that to some extent laid the groundwork for the sort of conservative law and order backlash that has been in the ascendancy since the 1970s, and that I think is usually treated as a more sort of a clearer sort of break with these earlier forms of policing during the high point of racial liberalism. So, on the afternoon of Sunday, June 20th, 1943, a series of brawls broke out between whites and blacks on Belle Isle, Detroit's largest public park. Fueled by rumors that a black person had thrown a white baby from a bridge, the unrest quickly spread to other areas of the city. State troopers were mobilized, and by the time the violence was quelled 3 days later, 34 people were dead, The vast majority of those killed were black men, more than half at the hands of law enforcement officers. In direct response to the riot, the city created the Mayor's Interracial Committee, which comprised state employees and civic leaders from both white and black communities. Its primary purpose was to work with other organizations in the city to, quote, cool racial tensions and prevent a repeat of the 1943 riot. This led to the launching of a new program in the city, the Community Barometer. The program was designed to help local state officials identify areas that were experiencing high levels of tension before they erupted into interpersonal conflicts. To do so, the committee recruited 30 volunteer reporters whom they believed will be well positioned to assess race relations in their community, which included contacts in government offices, local clergy, and community organizers. They asked these reporters to submit incident reports if they saw anything or heard any rumors that suggested racial tensions were rising. Each report was assigned a number and coded according to a series of predefined categories: date, time, location, severity, number of aggressors involved, their age and their race. Over time, the committee tried to establish general patterns within the data. For example, incidents involving verbal abuse or physical violence seemed primarily to occur in the late afternoon or early evening, they argued. A particular concern to the committee was the increase in reported acts of aggression during the summer. They believed that hot weather must lead to an increase in tension because it, quote, brings people onto the streets and into parks and places of amusement where contacts with other people are frequent, end quote. It was further suggested that in overcrowded slum areas, hot weather was particularly liable to make tempers short, causing acts of violence to flare out whenever people heard rumors of wrongdoing. The committee consequently decided that certain densely populated, and here is where we would see also predominantly black districts of Detroit, required additional monitoring. Within these neighborhoods, teachers, bartenders, barbers, and beauticians were all invited to serve as reporters for their communities, bringing the total number of informants to nearly 200. Concerns about young black men being especially volatile and likely to engage in violence also prompted efforts to connect the program more closely with other government agencies. Most ominous was a request that the police appoint someone to act as a full-time liaison with the community barometer. The surveillance network that the barometer created extended into black and white communities in Detroit. In the latter, informants were asked to pay particular attention to so-called blockbusters who spread racist propaganda in order to buy property cheaply from fearful whites and then sell it at a huge profit to blacks. But when rising tensions were detected in predominantly black communities, they were treated with greater urgency and generated a more robust response. For instance, in August 1944, Community Barometer received multiple reports that tension was increasing within a black neighborhood. Staff conferred with local NAACP leaders who suggested organizing a neighborhood jamboree to try and decrease tension. They secured access to public spaces and resources, asked their reporters to advertise the jamboree in churches, schools, and bowling alleys. As people assembled the jamboree, a band played patriotic songs. This was followed by a screening of the Negro Soldier, which was apparently met with, quote, lusty boos for the swastika and rousing applause for the American flag, end quote. A police lieutenant then addressed the crowd, asking for patience from them and reassuring them that his department was doing everything possible to help them with their difficulties. So the difference in intensity in these interventions reflected, I'm arguing, the tendency to see black residents as more volatile, meaning that a spike in tension through the tools of this barometer required these lusty displays of patriotism in order to try and prevent violent confrontations. White communities, on the other hand, could eventually be persuaded through education to reject rumors and embrace integration. And this difference, I suggest, reflects what scholars like Darrell Michael Scott have talked about as this tendency for white liberals during this period to assume that decades of oppression had produced a damaged black psyche that produced antisocial or criminal behavior. So concerns about urban violence led to the construction of a similar and more extensive program in Detroit in the mid-1960s. The backdrop for these events was a decade of deindustrialization, resulting in high rates of unemployment among young black men, alongside continuing legal and extra-legal, including through violence and intimidation, forms of segregation. The more immediate trigger for the state was the urban rebellions that were rippling across northern cities during this time. Detroit would become a focal point for this unrest when one Sunday evening in July '67, police raided an at-Browse drinking establishment in the Black 12th Street district, and in contrast with the regular practice of detaining only a few patrons and owners, chose to arrest 85 people, forcing them to wait outside. The crowd gathered and violent clashes soon broke out. The subsequent unrest lasted 6 days, leaving 43 dead and 467 injured, leading to over 7,000 arrests. In response to this unrest, in Detroit and many other cities, President Johnson established what became popularly known as the Kerner Commission to investigate its causes. Their report emphasized structural problems, including poor school systems, lack of job opportunities, and it also noted that rumors had significantly aggravated tensions and disorder in more than 65% of the disorders studied. So the committee went on to praise the city of Chicago, which had set up Rumor Central, an institution created in 1967 to act as a clearinghouse for what they saw as incendiary rumors circulating through the city. Citizens in Chicago were encouraged to call a telephone line if they heard a rumor that suggested social tensions were increasing in that area. And then working with local police and intelligence units, staff would try to locate the source of the rumor and test its veracity. The police would then take preemptive measures to address the unfolding situation by monitoring or arresting suspected agitators and spreading counter-information in areas of the city where the rumor was circulated. This prompted the Detroit mayor, James Kavanaugh, to announce on local television that he was forming a rumor center in Detroit, adding, quote, "Every citizen has it within his power to affect the conditions that give rise to violence. If he accepts uncritically every rumor, if he buys a gun neither understanding how it works nor its legal implications, if he endorses vigilante groups, he has contributed to an atmosphere that may well bring about the violence he has been seeking to avoid." So Rumor Central, I want to ask, is a kind of updated, expanded version of this earlier community barometer, collecting rumors for analysis and enabling state officials to therefore try and map what they saw as hotspots in the city, where there was division and tension increasing, and where violence could break out. So these centers were in operation not just in Chicago and Detroit, but nearly 100 cities across the US, and they were in operation until the early 1970s. And I want to just end by drawing attention to an important pattern that I've seen from working in the archives in Detroit, and one that's corroborated by a handful of studies that were undertaken at the time. The first is that the rumors that were called in, which numbered hundreds, sometimes thousands a week, around 80% of them came from white suburbanites. Okay? The nature of these rumors that they reported was also pretty consistent over time and across different cities. There were more elaborate rumors about black men abducting white children from shopping malls, raping white women, or forcing them into prostitution, or castrating white men. The common denominator, though, was that black people were somewhere that they weren't supposed to be, and that invited suspicion that they were going to cause trouble or commit a crime. The response of the state to these rumors is also telling. Here's the director of the Detroit Rumor Center reflecting on this realization that they were getting lots of calls from white communities. He says, quote, "When something happens that plays on people's racial fears, they need someone to talk to. So you can tell them that what's causing them concern is not true. Or you can call them and say it is true, but put it in perspective. Tell them that just because people are marching, it doesn't mean they're going to burn down your shopping center tomorrow. People sit in the suburbs and convince themselves they're going to be killed, so we're sort of a crutch." So in responding to white collars, staff saw their primary mission as providing psychological support and enabling white suburbanites to be able to still navigate and move through the city, get to work, pick up their children from school. On the other hand, while the centre may not have received many calls from black citizens, it did have important implications for their communities. Rumor Centre staff frequently consulted local police about rumours they were hearing, at times requesting clarification about an unfolding situation, at others providing tip-offs about possible outbreaks of unrest. So as the same director also noted, we're sort of a team as far as the police department is concerned. I would consider this type of operation as being akin to police more than being on the other side. Indeed, when the centre was closed between 6 p.m. and 8 a.m., its phone exchange was transferred directly to the Detroit Police Department headquarters, where it was integrated into surveillance operations. Consequently, the program worked to intensify the surveillance of young black men who could be monitored and detained if police believed they were planning to cause trouble, based on rumours that others had called in. So, what I want to argue is that this shows how a lot of the material and ideological groundwork for this sort of law and order backlash in the late 60s and early 70s was constructed by, I would argue, racial liberals, or at least there's some common threads here that come through from that earlier, immediate post-war years around fears around black criminality and around the need for expanded forms of surveillance. And I think that we see interesting ways in which that plays out today. One can think, for example, of the two black men who were arrested last week, or was it the week before, in Starbucks because they were loitering. How did that come about? Because someone called the police to say there's these men in this space. It's uncomfortable. They're not doing anything in particular, but they don't belong here. And I think what we need to think about also in terms of recent police shootings, how many of these actions are in fact triggered by the racial panic of a third party calling in those concerns and rumors about things they think they are seeing or think they are about to happen. So I'll leave it there because I know we have our third speaker and we can maybe even roll some questions together, I think, at the end of the session.
Obviously, I'll be quick. So, this was clearly made for the taller person in mind, so I'm going to move this over just a little bit. So, my session, or my portion or contribution on looking at white rage in black communities, and more specifically white terror campaigns, oftentimes in the contemporary times when we talk about riots, and race riots specifically, there's this picture of young black men tearing up communities, right? But prior to 1963, when you talked about these riots, you were talking about white mobs that were going through black communities and destroying property and lives and institutions. And so that's a big part of what I wanted to talk about. And I'm glad that you brought up the Kerner Commission, because that's what prompted this storytelling. And that, and so in some ways it's an alternative to the Kerner Commission report, because even though it was taught that the Kerner Commission report was supposed to be about civil unrest, but the focus was on black civil unrest. And so there was not a lot, although he talked about racism and institutional racism, it didn't talk about the terror and the undermining that occurred in black communities. So a lot of times say, oh, things were so much better if we just invested in the black community, then things will be all right, without acknowledging that when the black community has come together, so we think about Tulsa and here in North Carolina, even Wilmington. If you were to look at Wilmington now, you would not believe that over 100 years ago, it was a predominantly black middle-class community. And oftentimes these were incited based off of rumors that a black man had raped a white woman, had killed a white woman. And so oftentimes this problematizing of black rage and normalizing of white rage is a common theme that you see. And with the exception of the Harlem race riots that occurred in 1935 and 1943, race riots were typically a result of white rage. And so one of the things that you can say that both white terror campaigns and black urban uprisings have in common is this underlying cause of white supremacy. But the aftermath is very different. So in white riots, you would find loss of life, mostly black lives, loss of black-owned property, and that's something that's very important, is that it was black-owned property that was damaged the most. Mass displacement in Wilmington in 1890 1898, it was 1,600 black families that were displaced. In Tulsa, it was a similar number. So that's the thing, you have all these people who were living in these communities, decline in black patents, a loss of constitutional rights, including the voting right, free speech, right to assemble, free press. That was usually the first thing that got destroyed was the newspaper and the schools and the hospital. The right to bear arms, equal protection under the law, and due process. So in Tulsa, when people talked about the riots of Black Wall Street, a black man was accused of murder, and there were rumors that there was going to be a white mob that was going to go and take him and lynch him before he could stand trial. So the people at the newspaper had decided this wasn't going to happen anymore because it had already happened about a month prior, where a black man was accused of something and then he was taken from the jail and killed. So they decided to go and get him. And when he went to go get him, there was a rumor that they killed the whole police department, basically. And so then that incited the riot. And they're killing white women, they're killing the sheriffs. We got to go in. And when you look at pictures of those events, when they're supposed to be protecting and escorting the black community to safe places, it looks as though the black people are the criminals, even when you're seeing them with children and families. On the other hand, when you talk about black urban uprisings, the aftermath is loss of life, mostly black, so there's a consistent theme. But the difference is white-owned property is damaged, and it's usually highlighted by white flight that was occurring before the riots and then after. Now, this white-owned property damage is important because when we talk about in the 1960s, when you couldn't really get loans, so you had these property contracts, you couldn't get a mortgage because of redlining. You would have these contracts, and you could, buying furniture, how right now we have the rent to own, there were things that were like that were even more predatory that were occurring. And so oftentimes when people were going in, and you see people like, why are they going in and stealing refrigerators, and why are they stealing TVs and sofas? They were getting back what had been repossessed, right? So they had property that had been repossessed, oftentimes in very cruel ways, and ways that were exploitive. They were going back and getting their property. So oftentimes these riots were looked at as being just people just going in and destroying without thought of consequences, but or even just direction. But they were actually very targeted. They were targeting stores and bank owners or loan owners who had been exploiting them. And so those are the things that you have to think about. And so even when the other underlying thing for black urban violence is police brutality, especially in the 1960s, and you see that occurring right now, is this police brutality. And even then, it's still not, let's just destroy and raise up an entire community. Oftentimes you see when people were standing up even more contemporarily, that people were standing up and yelling at police officers because they were the source of the anger and the strife. And the main thing I want to conclude with is that even when you're talking about the Kerner Commission report and in contemporary times, President Obama's 21st century policing, there's this need to control black rage because it's a problem. And even though we have this long history of white rage, there's never been a presidential commission on white rage. Even when you look at East St. Louis riots, which killed hundreds of people in a matter of 2 days, there has never been a presidential commission on white racism and white violence. And just last year, we had the incidents in Charlottesville that happened multiple times that year, and there still hasn't been a commission that looks at white racism and white violence. The closest we've got is the Kerner Commission that actually acknowledges that white racism may be an issue. So I know we're running out of time, and thank you for your patience with me. So we probably have a minute or so for questions. So I'll stand here. We have 2 seats. But are there questions for any of us here?
Yes, I enjoyed the presentation. So, based on all of these facts, what can be done to actually reduce, eliminate the bias, so to say, for our time?
Thanks, and that's a great question, and a difficult one to try and answer. Part of why one of the things in this conference and this presentation is because I think ideas around what can be done is much more prevalent in conversations than in most academic conferences. I think one part of it is thinking about Keisha's talk about the need to educate about the sort of history of these forms of white violence, of white rage as well, which are otherwise just sort of removed from the broader kind of conversation in the US. And I think part of it is we need to start questioning the ways in which white anxiety and white panic have a direct access to the police, to the state, and an expectation. And of course, many of the people in those positions share those things, sort of anxieties and unease, direct expectation of instant kinds of responses from that work to construct these landscapes of threat and of danger that then also when police are going into this already have some ideas around that. There's been little, for example, investigation into why some of those people called in what we know are erroneous stories around there's a black man in this community, there's a black man in Walmart looking at in the gun section. There's very little challenging of that, and I think that some of that needs to go on. Like, what were the kind of stories that triggered this kind of police response in the first place to that as well? And also, again, to think about the difference between whereas what is when there is much more legitimate concerns about threats of violence and fear within black communities, why doesn't that get picked up on by the state and by the police?
I came in late, so I'm not going to address this, but just in following up what you're saying a little bit. So 2 things I wanted to ask about. I think there is a need to improve the awareness of American history, like you're talking about Wilmington. And Wilmington was a coup d'etat, right? So it's the only coup d'etat that happened in our country, and it's not even spoken of. We don't know about it. It's not referenced. And the only reason I found out about it is because I moved to North Carolina 5 years ago, and in the back of the museum, it talks about Wilmington, right? And so I think there is a need for us to openly have these conversations and inform, and it needs to be in our educational curriculum, right? So there are a lot of things that need to be done.
Well, I think one thing that I'm glad you brought that point up, because just because people don't know the particulars about their local history or their national history doesn't mean that they're not affected by it.
Yes.
So if you, and I'm a recent transplant to North Carolina, and when I talked about going to the beach, I had an older person tell me, like, be careful in Wilmington. And they didn't say that there's going to be a riot or anything, but it has a reputation for being unfriendly to black people. And so there are things that maintain, even if people don't know the exact specific histories and moments, it still has impact. I know you had a second question.
I agree completely, and I think awareness will help to inform why those feelings are there. My second question was about, I don't know if you addressed the police departments as I've heard referred to as a third gang in communities, and when black communities think about police departments, it's not about safety oftentimes. I don't know if you spoke about that, and if so, I'm wondering if you haven't, can you talk a little bit about how police departments are behaving in black communities?
Well, I think that a big part of it is when we talk about state-sanctioned violence versus state violence. And so before, in these white riots, and a lot of times the things that were happening in the 60s, you had state-sanctioned violence. So where either the police were involved in the mayhem, or they allowed it to happen, so they stood by idly. And you even saw that in Charlottesville, where the police were like, we're outgunned, we're outnumbered, just let them go ahead and do what they're gonna do. Compared to state violence is where you would see things like Mike Brown and Freddie Gray and Sandra Bland, where it's the police that are actually enforcing laws or in disproportionate ways are killing people or being abusive, and even the court systems, the way that the laws are applied. So you might have equal laws, but the protection is different. And so I think that I wouldn't necessarily say a third gang, but it's definitely some complicity and a lot of looking the other way. And I don't want to stop.